My name's Nick. I'm 28, and if you told me a year ago that I'd be recording my own family just to protect myself, I'd have laughed. But after what's happened, I've learned that sometimes the people who swear they love you the most are the ones who'll twist the knife the deepest, then pretend they're the ones bleeding. Growing up, I used to think our family was just a little passionate. That's what Mom always called it when arguments erupted over dinner or when my older sister, Rebecca, got what she wanted while I got told to be more understanding. She's 5 years older than me, always had a sharp tongue and a way of turning every situation in her favor. If something went wrong, she'd find a way to make it my fault. And Mom would sigh and tell me to let it go. Nick, she's your sister. Dad wasn't really in the picture after the divorce. He called on birthdays, sent the occasional check, and that was about it. So it was just the three of us, me, Mom, and Rebecca. For most of my childhood, I thought that was enough. I didn't realize how much I was bending myself to fit into a family dynamic that never really had room for me unless I was useful. It started to become obvious when I got my first job out of college. I was working as a technician at a local IT company, not making a fortune but earning enough to help Mom when she needed it. Rebecca, on the other hand, always seemed to be in crisis mode, needing a temporary loan, asking Mom to watch her kids, or having some new excuse about why she couldn't keep a steady job. She had 2 kids with her husband, Adam, and somehow, despite their constant money problems, they managed to afford weekend trips, new furniture, and a kitchen renovation that fell into their laps. The first time I realized just how different our standards were was on Mom's birthday 2 years ago. I'd saved up to buy her a necklace. Nothing fancy, but thoughtful. When she opened it, she smiled softly and said, "You shouldn't have spent so much." Rebecca then handed her a framed photo of her family and made a big show of how memories are more valuable than material things. Mom teared up and hugged her, calling it the most heartfelt gift. I remember sitting there, feeling that familiar sting of being dismissed. It wasn't about the necklace, it was about the double standard. When Rebecca gave something, it was love. When I did, it was excessive. Things got worse after Adam lost his job last year. Rebecca started visiting Mom more often, always looking stressed, always with some story about how they were trying their best. And every time, Mom would sigh and dip into her savings to help out. I'd tell her, "Mom, you can't keep enabling them. You need to think about your own future." But she'd just shake her head and say, "You don't understand, Nick. You don't have kids. You'd do anything for family." Then, 3 months ago, Mom called me one evening sounding anxious. "Nick," she said, "I need your help. The bank's been sending letters. I'm behind on the mortgage payments." I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, my stomach dropping. Mom had always been careful with money. I asked her how it happened, and she hesitated before saying, "It's been hard with the rising costs, and I helped your sister a few times." A few times. Those words echoed in my head. I asked her how far behind she was, and when she told me, I felt sick. If she didn't make the next payment soon, she could lose the house, the only place that still felt like home. So, I did what I thought any decent son would do. I told her I'd take care of it. I went to the bank, took out a small personal loan under my name, and covered what she owed. It wasn't easy, my credit wasn't perfect, and it meant tightening my own budget, but it felt like the right thing to do. Mom cried when I told her. She said I'd saved her life. Rebecca, of course, barely acknowledged it. She texted me, "That's really kind of you," followed by a heart emoji, like I'd just done her a small favor. A week later, everything started to unravel. It was a normal Saturday morning. I was scrolling through social media before heading out to work when a post caught my eye. A picture of turquoise water, white sand, and a cocktail in hand. The caption read, "Finally made it to the Maldives. Family getaway we all deserved." It was Rebecca, her, Adam, and the kids, smiling wide in matching beach outfits. I blinked at the screen, thinking it had to be a throwback. But the timestamp said 2 hours ago. I just sat there, staring. My heart was pounding. The same sister whose husband was between jobs. The same sister whose family could barely afford groceries. The same sister Mom had been bailing out for months, was now on a luxury vacation halfway across the world. I tried to tell myself maybe Adam's family had paid for it. Maybe they'd won some contest. Anything but the worst possibility. But as the days went by, Rebecca posted more, dinners by candlelight, boat rides, private villa tours. It didn't look like a spontaneous trip. It looked planned. I decided to visit Mom that Sunday. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. I sat down with her in the kitchen and asked gently, "Mom, did you know Rebecca's in the Maldives?" Her face went blank. "Oh, she mentioned something about a short trip." "What? A short trip? Mom, that place costs thousands." She frowned, avoiding my eyes. "I'm sure they found a deal. You know," she said, "Adam's cousin works in travel." I could tell she didn't believe it either. But she didn't want to face what it implied. Then I asked, "Did you give her any money recently? After I helped with the mortgage?" That's when she hesitated. Just for a second, but long enough to answer the question without words. I pressed gently, "Mom, please, just tell me the truth." She looked down at her cup of tea. She said she needed help catching up on bills. I didn't know it was for that. I felt my jaw tighten. "Mom, that was my loan money. The money I took out to help you keep this house." She flinched, whispering. I didn't think she'd misuse it. She said, she promised. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts were racing between disbelief and anger. It wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about the betrayal. I'd gone into debt to keep Mom safe, and my sister had turned around and used that same help as a free ticket to paradise. I needed answers. So, I called Rebecca the next morning. She answered, sounding cheerful. "Hey, little brother. What's up?" "Just curious," I said flatly. "How's the Maldives?" There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "Oh, you saw the photos. Beautiful, right? We really needed this." "Yeah," I said slowly. "Crazy thing, though, I thought you guys were broke." Another pause, then she said lightly, "Don't be so dramatic, Nick. We're fine." I could feel my blood pressure rising. Fine enough to fly halfway across the world a week after Mom nearly lost her house. She sighed. "Oh, come on. Mom told you. She worries too much. We helped her out before, remember? It's family. We all help each other." Her tone was so casual it made me sick. "So where did the money come from, Rebecca?" There was silence on the line, followed by a low chuckle. "You did, bro, technically." I froze. "What did you just say?" She laughed again, like it was a joke. "Relax. Mom wanted to help us get back on our feet. You gave her that money to help, right? Well, she helped us. So really you helped too." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That was the moment something in me shifted. I'd always try to keep the peace, to stay the reasonable one. But hearing her say that, so smug, so entitled, snapped something inside me. I realized they both saw me as a resource, not a person. Someone to fix their mistakes. Someone who'd always say yes. But not this time. Because what Rebecca didn't know was that I'd been recording that entire phone call. And when I showed up at Mom's house later that week, I had every intention of using it. When Rebecca arrived that evening, still sun-kissed from her trip, the first thing she said when she saw me was, "Oh, don't tell me you're still upset about that money." I looked her dead in the eye and said quietly, "Tell the truth about what you did, or leave right now." She sneered. "You always make yourself the victim." Mom watched silently, torn. I unlocked my phone, hit play, and set it on the table. Seconds later, my sister's voice filled the room. Her laugh, her words, her arrogance. For a moment, the only sound in the room was my sister's voice echoing from the phone. It replayed that exact line, her smug laughter, her words dripping with entitlement. "You did, bro, technically." Mom's face drained of color as if someone had pulled the air right out of her lungs. Rebecca's smirk faltered for a split second before she rolled her eyes and scoffed. "Oh, come on, Nick. You're really recording private conversations now? That's low, even for you." I didn't answer. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't recognize the person standing in front of me anymore. This wasn't just the sister I grew up with. This was someone who saw me as nothing but a bank account with legs. Mom finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Rebecca, is this true? You used Nick's money for your trip?" Rebecca threw her hands up. "Oh my God, you're all being so dramatic. We just needed a break. Everything's been so stressful. Adam lost his job. The kids were miserable. I was barely holding it together. What's the big deal if we took some time to recharge?" I could barely believe what I was hearing. "The big deal," I said, my tone sharper than I intended, "is that Mom could have lost her house, and I took out a loan to stop that from happening. You took that money, the one thing keeping her safe, and used it to sip cocktails in the Maldives." Rebecca crossed her arms, glaring at me like I was the problem. "It's not like you're struggling, Nick. You have a stable job, no kids, no responsibilities. You can afford it. You've always been so selfish about money. That word, selfish, made me laugh out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it hurt. Selfish? You took money meant to save Mom's home. You lied. You laughed about it. And I'm the selfish one. Mom was still sitting at the table, silent, her eyes glistening. Rebecca, she said softly, please tell me he's wrong. Rebecca looked at her with that same defiance she'd always used to win arguments as a kid. I didn't lie. You said you wanted to help us get back on our feet, remember? You offered. I just took the chance to breathe a little. Mom buried her face in her hands. Oh my God. Rebecca. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to shout, to demand she admit what she'd done, but deep down I already knew how this would play out. It always did. Rebecca would manipulate, cry, spin the story until she was the victim again. And Mom, as much as she was hurt, would fold. She always did. And she did. When Mom finally lifted her head, her voice was small. Rebecca, what you did was wrong. But Nick, maybe she just didn't think it through. She's been under so much stress lately. That sentence broke something inside me. There it was again, the same cycle, the same excuses. Rebecca could burn down the house, and Mom would still hand her the matches and say she was just tired. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. So what now? You're going to pretend this didn't happen? You're going to keep letting her use you? Mom reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Nick, please don't make this harder. I'm not making it harder. I cut in. I'm trying to stop her from draining you dry. You're going to end up with nothing, Mom. Rebecca laughed quietly. You talk like you're the savior of the family. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with control, we wouldn't have to hide things from you. Hide things? I repeated. You mean steal things? Wow, she said, throwing up her hands. Steal? Seriously? You're unbelievable. You act like you're perfect, Nick, but you've always been jealous of me. Admit it. Jealous. That word hit me like a slap. Jealous of what? The endless drama? The manipulation? The way she made everyone else clean up her messes? I stared at her and said quietly, you know, Rebecca, it's kind of funny. You keep accusing everyone of jealousy, but maybe it's just easier than admitting you hate when someone doesn't fall for your act. Her smile faltered. For a split second, I saw the truth flicker in her expression. Insecurity, guilt, maybe even fear. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. She turned to Mom. See how he talks to me? He's always been like this. He thinks he's better than me. Mom didn't respond. She looked torn, her eyes darting between us. Both of you, please. This isn't helping. I wanted to say more, to shout the truth until she finally saw, but I knew it was useless. So I left. For days, I ignored both of their calls. I needed space to think, to breathe. But the silence didn't last long. Rebecca started posting again, not just photos, but captions. Family is complicated, but we always have each other. Grateful for people who forgive instead of judge. The comments from her friends made my stomach twist. You're such a great sister. You're always there for everyone. And then, 2 weeks later, Mom called me again. Her voice was shaky. Nick, your sister's been going through a hard time. She told me you're still angry. Can't you just let it go? Let it go. I asked, incredulous. Mom, she stole from both of us. She's family, she said weakly. You don't just cut off family. But that was the thing. I wasn't the one cutting anyone off. They'd been cutting me out for years. This was just the first time I'd noticed the bleeding. The real breaking point came a month later. Mom called to invite me over for Sunday dinner. She said Rebecca would be there, and she wanted us to make peace. Against my better judgment, I agreed. A part of me hoped that maybe, finally, Mom would stand her ground. Maybe Rebecca would apologize. Maybe things could be fixed. I arrived a few minutes early. Mom was setting the table, humming softly. She seemed calmer, almost hopeful. I'm glad you came, Nick, she said. Let's just have a nice evening, okay? I nodded, trying to push the tension out of my mind. Rebecca arrived shortly after, all smiles, carrying a dessert box like nothing had ever happened. She kissed Mom on the cheek, glanced at me, and said, Wow, you actually came. Didn't think you'd show your face after that stunt. I clenched my jaw. What stunt? The recording, she said, smirking. It was such a betrayal, Nick. Who does that to their own sister? Someone who's tired of being lied to, I said evenly. She rolled her eyes. You're unbelievable. Dinner was tense. Every conversation felt like walking on glass. Rebecca kept making subtle digs about my boring job, my lonely apartment, my need to be in control. Mom kept trying to change the subject, pretending not to notice. Then, halfway through dessert, Rebecca leaned back in her chair and said casually, "By the way, Mom and I have been talking. We think it'd be good if you helped out a bit more around here. You know, with bills and stuff." I set down my fork. "What bills?" She exchanged a glance with Mom. "The house. Repairs, maintenance, property taxes. It's a lot for Mom to handle alone. And since you're doing well," I turned to Mom. "You agree with this?" She looked guilty. "Nick, the roof needs fixing. And Rebecca's been helping me with groceries lately, so," I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Helping with groceries? You mean with my money?" Rebecca slammed her hand on the table. "You're such a martyr, Nick. You think every little thing you do makes you the hero of the story. You're not the only one who sacrifices for this family." I leaned forward. "What exactly have you sacrificed, Rebecca? Because from where I'm sitting, all you've done is take." Her eyes narrowed. "You really don't get it, do you? Mom loves me more because I'm there for her. I visit, I call, I help out. You just throw money around and think that makes you a good son." That was the dagger. I looked at Mom, waiting for her to say something, to defend me, to correct her, but she stayed silent. Rebecca smiled faintly, seeing my reaction. "See? Even she knows it's true." And that was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped completely. I stood up slowly. "You know what, Rebecca? You can have your version of the truth. You always do. But I'm done playing along." "Meaning what?" she asked, her tone suddenly wary. I looked between her and Mom. "Meaning that whatever's coming next, you won't see it coming." Rebecca laughed, though her voice trembled slightly. "Oh, please. What are you going to do, Nick? Post another recording?" I smiled faintly. "No. This time, I'll let you expose yourself." And then I walked out, leaving both of them at the table, Mom pale and silent, Rebecca fuming but confused. That night, as I sat in my car, I decided something. If they wanted to play games with my trust, my money, and my silence, then fine. I'd play too, but on my terms. And when I was done, they wouldn't just lose my help. They'd lose the one thing they valued more than anything else, their reputation. After that dinner, I disappeared from the family's radar. Not out of spite, exactly, though there was a little of that. Mostly, it was because I had to rebuild myself. The part of me that had been stretched thin from years of pretending that their entitlement was normal, that their manipulation was love, that my worth was measured by how much I could give without complaint. The week after I walked out of Mom's house, I spent long hours alone in my apartment, thinking about everything that had happened. Rebecca's smug laughter, Mom's silence, Adam's indifferent smile in every vacation photo. It was like peeling back layers of wallpaper, only to realize the wall underneath had been rotten all along. For the first time in years, I let myself feel everything I'd been burying. Anger, frustration, sadness, betrayal. It was messy, uncomfortable, and exhausting, but it was also freeing. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed one night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how I had been bent, stretched, and ignored for decades, and feeling a spark of clarity. They didn't define me. Their approval, their validation, their praise, none of it mattered. What mattered was me, what I could do for myself, what I could build without constantly being pulled into their chaos. I started small. I canceled all the unnecessary monthly payments that had been going to help Rebecca. I made a budget that worked for me, planned out a way to pay off the loan I'd taken for Mom, and slowly started saving again. I told myself it wasn't revenge, it was survival. But secretly, I knew this was the foundation for something bigger, a way to reclaim my power, my pride, and eventually my dignity. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into projects, staying late, learning new skills, networking quietly. I wasn't looking for promotions. I was building leverage. For the first time, I realized I could succeed on my own terms. The sense of accomplishment I felt wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Every task completed, every client satisfied, every problem solved without anyone else's interference felt like a tiny victory against years of being underestimated. During that period, I also started paying attention to my own life outside of work. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from because family drama had consumed too much of my time. I started taking care of my health more seriously, running a few mornings a week, cooking meals instead of grabbing takeout, even reading books that weren't related to work or self-help. It was mundane, steady progress, but I realized that building a life for myself wasn't about drama or confrontation. It was about laying bricks, one day at a time, until I had something solid to stand on. Meanwhile, the family dynamic outside my control began to crack on its own. I'd occasionally hear through mutual acquaintances or social media that Rebecca and Adam's financial situation wasn't as perfect as they portrayed. There were hints, canceled plans, late payments, vague explanations about expenses. I didn't revel in it. I stayed in my own lane. But it was satisfying to know that the fantasy they projected to the world was fragile, built on shaky ground. Then came the pivotal moment, the opportunity that changed everything. At work, my manager approached me with a project that had been languishing for months because no one had the time or patience to handle it properly. It was risky, complex, and high profile, but I knew it was exactly what I needed. I said yes without hesitation. The project consumed me. I spent nights analyzing data, creating strategies, and finding solutions where others had given up. And slowly, it began to pay off. The client was thrilled, internal stakeholders were impressed, and word of my competence started spreading quietly. Within months, I was offered a promotion, not the flashy kind with a new title, but one that came with decision-making power, autonomy, and resources I'd never had before. I accepted. It was like stepping into a new world where I was finally respected not because I was related to someone else or because I was quietly giving away my money, but because I had earned it. With that newfound stability, I began to rebuild my finances aggressively. I paid off the loan I had taken from Mom entirely, then set up an emergency fund, then invested in a small side business I'd been thinking about for years, an online tech consultancy focused on helping small businesses automate operations. It was slow at first, but with the skills I had honed and the reputation I was building, clients started coming in steadily. I realized I was capable of independence, real, tangible independence, and it was intoxicating. Even more than the financial aspect, I felt a shift in my own sense of self-worth. I wasn't just someone who gave to keep the peace. I was someone who could set boundaries, take risks, and succeed without relying on the approval of others. I stopped worrying about how my family viewed me. The anger that had fueled me at first gradually transformed into something colder, sharper, the kind of resolve that doesn't need to be shouted to be effective. And then, a month into this rebuilding, something unexpected happened. I ran into a former colleague at a conference. He asked how things were going, and I mentioned, almost casually, that I'd started consulting on the side. His eyes lit up. "Actually," he said, "I've been looking for someone exactly like you for a big project. High stakes, but big payoff." Interested, I thought about it for a moment and said yes. That single decision changed the trajectory of my business. The project was huge, challenging, and exhausting, but it validated everything I'd been working toward. By the end of the quarter, I had secured multiple long-term clients, and my consultancy was finally on its feet. I wasn't rich, not yet, but I was building something that no one in my family could ever take away from me. While I was growing professionally, I noticed subtle changes in my personal life as well. Friends I'd lost touch with came back into the fold, drawn not by obligation, but by respect. I started dating again, cautiously at first, but the confidence I'd gained allowed me to navigate relationships in a healthy way, setting boundaries I'd never known I could enforce. I realized that part of the revenge, the real revenge, wasn't about humiliating Rebecca or proving Mom wrong. It was about becoming someone who couldn't be manipulated, controlled, or dismissed. And yet, even as I was rising, there was a shadow lingering. I hadn't forgotten Rebecca's laugh, her words, the way she had treated me as a source rather than a person. I hadn't forgotten Mom's silence, the way she always tried to smooth over conflicts rather than confront the truth. Every time I scrolled past a photo of Rebecca's life, the fake perfect vacations, the staged smiles, a little fire ignited inside me. Not the raw, reactive fire of anger, but a calculated, measured one. I was building, and soon, they would see the results. Then, one evening, I received a message from a mutual family friend. It was short, almost casual. "Rebecca and Adam are struggling financially. Something about debts they can't cover. Thought you might want to know." I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. This wasn't about celebrating their misfortune. It was about the scales beginning to tip, the invisible ledger of favors and lies finally balancing itself out. And for the first time, I realized how powerful it was to be untouchable, to be the one who had all the cards and could decide when, if ever, to play them. That night, I thought about all the years I had spent bending, compromising, and sacrificing. I thought about the loan I'd taken, the sleepless nights worrying about Mom's house, the constant manipulation I had endured. And I smiled quietly to myself because I knew that I wasn't just recovering. I was thriving. I was reclaiming everything they had taken from me, not through confrontation, but through patience, strategy, and relentless self-respect. But deep down, I also knew the next phase was coming. Building myself up was only the beginning. There was a reckoning on the horizon, and I would be ready. Not because I wanted revenge in the childish sense, but because some truths needed to be exposed, and some people needed to face consequences for treating me, for taking from me, as though my life and effort meant nothing. For now, though, I kept my head down, my work steady, and my plans quiet. I smiled when Rebecca's posts appeared online, all sun and smiles, oblivious to the storm brewing quietly just beyond her curated reality. The difference this time was I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. I was patient. I was untouchable. And when the time came, the revelation would be inevitable and devastating. After months of quiet rebuilding, the real work began, not the kind with spreadsheets and client calls, but the slow, meticulous kind that requires patience, nerve, and the willingness to lean into discomfort. I wasn't interested in theatrics for the sake of spectacle. I wanted a result that would make the truth unavoidable. The first step was to make sure my facts were bulletproof. I'd always kept copies of the loan paperwork in my bank statements, but I started digging deeper. Timestamps, transfer memos, emails I'd sent to Mom when I arranged the loan, the messages where Rebecca thanked Mom for her help, little notes and emojis that suddenly looked different when seen in context. There's a strange clarity that comes from assembling a record. You stop telling yourself stories about people's intentions and start looking at what they actually did. The more I compiled, the more the pattern revealed itself. A series of casual omissions, evasive answers, and then outright lies. It was ugly, but it was true. I printed everything, organized it into binders, and made digital backups. Control, I realized, begins with certainty. Next came allies. I had been careful not to bring my new life into the family drama. Partly because I wanted to be independent, partly because the fewer loose ends I left, the cleaner my eventual move would be. But allies don't always have to be family, and truth is far easier to prove when you have people who can corroborate the story. There was James, the former colleague from the conference who'd helped me land a major consulting client. He owed me nothing, but he respected competence and hated bullshit almost as much as I did. Over coffee, I told him the condensed version: loan, Maldives, recording, Mom's inertia. He listened without interrupting, then said two words that felt like a lifeline. How can I help? He didn't offer emotional platitudes. He offered logistics. He had access to a network of small business accountants and a friend at a local gallery who was connected in the community. That sounded odd at first, but I'd learned that reputations are fragile, and the right whisper in the right ear can bend a narrative the way a single gust bends a reed. I asked him to keep everything quiet, and he agreed. I also reached out to Maria, an old friend from college who'd become a paralegal. She met me for a long walk in the park and talked practicalities. Chain of custody for documents, what constituted evidence, how to request bank records without tipping my hand. She didn't sugarcoat things. You can reveal the truth, she said, but only if it's airtight. Otherwise, you'll look like the angry brother. That stung, because I knew she was right. The point wasn't humiliation, it was accountability. She agreed to guide me through the steps for requesting formal records and advised how to phrase requests to the bank so they couldn't wave it off as a family dispute. I found myself grateful for the kind of help that was competent and unemotional. It steadied me. While I gathered proof and professional counsel, I also worked to rebuild Mom's autonomy so that when the time came, she could stand on her own without being gaslit into doubt. It wasn't about forcing her to choose between us. It was about making sure she had the tools to see clearly. I met with her under the pretense of helping plan some home repairs, innocuous things that gave us a chance to talk in practical terms about her finances. I taught her how to read bank statements line by line. I showed her the binder of documents I'd assembled, but only the parts that concerned her mortgage and the loan I'd taken out. I didn't want to overwhelm her with betrayal. I wanted to give her facts so she could make decisions. She was hesitant at first, as if the reality of what had happened would shatter something in her. But then she surprised me. She asked questions. She took notes. It was a small, quiet reclamation of agency, and it felt like watching someone wake up to sunlight after years of living with the curtains half drawn. Financial leverage was important, but so was timing. I didn't want to confront Rebecca in the heat of a petty outburst or a family dinner where feelings would cloud judgment. I wanted a moment when the truth would land where it mattered, among people whose opinions could not be swayed by charm or tears. In our small town, social capital still mattered. Rebecca thrived on it. She belonged to the neighborhood association, volunteered at school events, and cultivated the kind of image that made neighbors defer to her. If the narrative could shift in those circles, it would ripple outward. So I built a plan that moved on two fronts: the factual trail to discredit the narrative of benevolent help, and a quiet strategy to let people see the discrepancy between the curated story Rebecca sold and the reality the documents proved. There were practical risks, of course. Exposing a family's private finances can break things that can't be repaired. I thought about that a lot. Was I becoming the thing I once despised, someone wielding power to wound? I came back to the same answer. I wasn't seeking cruelty. I was seeking truth and fairness. For years, I'd been the only person who absorbed the fallout of everyone else's choices. I wasn't interested in public shaming for its own sake. I wanted justice, accountability, and the restoration of boundaries. If that meant revealing embarrassing truths, so be it. There's a difference between revenge that tears and revenge that corrects. My aim was the latter. I started to lay groundwork in subtler ways. I reconnected with neighbors who'd been friendly with Mom, not to gossip, but to remind them, gently, of the realities of single-income households, the costs of home ownership, the way small, repeated loans can hollow someone out. Conversations were casual, not accusatory. Did you ever notice the mail piling up at Mrs. Harper's house? Did you see the notice from the bank on the community board? People listened. People commented. Word spread, not as a pointed attack on Rebecca, but as a pattern that, once observed, didn't align with the glossy vacation posts. It was slow and strategic, like planting seeds in soil and waiting for the first shoots to surface. At the same time, I sharpened my digital strategy. I created a secure folder with all the evidence, time-stamped and backed up in multiple places. I encrypted it and gave a copy to James and Maria, people who, if anything unexpected happened to me or the files, could verify their authenticity. I made sure the files were organized so that anyone reviewing them would see a chronological story: the loan disbursement, the transfers, Rebecca's messages, her Maldives postings, and the exchanges that made her smug statement undeniable. It felt bureaucratic, almost clinical, but there's a power in that clarity. When emotions run high, clear documentation is like clean water. It reveals whether something is muddied or pure. The turning point in the setup came when I learned that Rebecca had been planning a community appreciation party, a charity-ish affair at the local community center where she, as a volunteer coordinator, would be honored for her generosity and service. It was the perfect altar for her carefully cultivated image. People smiling, speeches praising her devotion, neighbors applauding her supposed sacrifices. I almost laughed when I was told. Of course she would do something like that. Of course she'd step into a spotlight where her narrative would be reinforced. The universe has an ironic sense of timing. That's when the plan hardened into specifics. I would attend the event. I would not storm the stage. I'd never pull a public stunt that would let her paint me as unstable. Instead, I would ensure that the people who mattered, the town council members, the PDA president, a few mutual friends who respected truth, received a copy of the dossier in advance. I planned to meet privately with a couple of them before the event, hand them the evidence, and let the weight of unvarnished facts do the rest. For the community, it wouldn't be about me attacking Rebecca. It would be about reconciling the gap between deed and reputation. Those who cared about fairness would have the chance to examine the record and make their own judgments. There was one more piece, Mom. I had to be certain she was ready. This was not a move I could make without her consent. The revelation would force her to choose: stand with the comforting story she'd been holding on to, or face the betrayal and its consequences. I spent long evenings with her, not pressuring but preparing, walking her through what might happen and what it would mean. She cried. She protested. She feared losing the family she loved. But when I saw her finally look at the binder and meet my eyes with that weary, fierce clarity, I knew she understood. If the event was the sword, she agreed to be the shield. She wanted truth, even if it hurt. In the last days before the party, everything felt taut, like a drawn bow. Small coincidences unnerved me. A neighbor I'd barely spoken to suddenly offering to help with the community center setup. Rebecca posting a carousel of perfect photos with her kids and a caption about giving back. I checked the dossier one more time, breathed through my nerves, and made sure everyone who needed to see it had received it in confidence. James promised to be there, not as muscle, but as a witness. Maria sent a text. If you need me to subpoena anything, I will. But for now, let the evidence speak. Mom hugged me in the kitchen, the way she used to when I was a kid after a nightmare. Be kind, she said quietly. I nodded, though kindness felt like a strange costume to wear when you'd been planning a reckoning. On the morning of the event, I felt oddly calm. I dressed in a shirt that didn't shout, jeans that didn't show off, neutral, unremarkable. It felt right. The power of this wasn't in theatrics. It was in the reveal of truth. I drove to the community center and parked a few blocks away so I could walk in like anyone else. The center was buzzing. Folding chairs, volunteer t-shirts, banners celebrating community heroes. Rebecca was already there, glowing in the way people do when they're certain the world sees them as they want to be seen. She hugged neighbors, posed for photos, and laughed in that breathy way she used to disarm anyone who asked too many questions. My heart thudded in my chest as I stepped through the doors. I had the binder in my bag, the encrypted files mirrored on a thumb drive in my pocket. I caught sight of James near the back, the PDA president chatting with a local councilman, and a few familiar faces I'd intentionally included on the distribution list. The air felt electric with possibility and peril. Rebecca was taking the stage for her introduction. The room hushed. She smiled like a queen. I moved toward the exit. I had promised Mom I wouldn't make a scene, but then she looked directly toward where I stood and her expression shifted. For a second, vulnerability crossed her face before she smiled again, as if she'd dismissed whatever thought had flickered. That second felt like an open door. I sat back down, my fingers tightening around the handle of my bag. The plan was set, the players in place, and the truth ready to be given a home. As Rebecca began her speech, praising community spirit and talking about gratitude, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down. A message from Maria. They reviewed the records. Ready when you are. Then another. PDA president just texted. Meeting in 10. My breath shortened. This was it. I could stand up now, hand the binder to the PDA president, let the quiet machinery of verification start, and watch the carefully built facade begin to fracture. Or I could wait, let Rebecca finish her speech, and risk her pivoting, explaining away, weaving new lies. I looked up at Rebecca's smiling face, at Mom in the third row with hands clasped so tight her knuckles were pale, and felt the swell of something that wasn't just anger anymore. It was the knowledge that every choice I'd made, every late night, every saved paycheck, every calculated ally, had led to this room where truth could finally meet audience. I stood up, my chair creaking in the hush, and started walking toward the table where the PDA president sat, the binder heavy in my bag, and the world narrowing to the single act I was about to commit. I stepped toward the table with the binder, each footfall calm, deliberate, while the room held its breath, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend. Rebecca was finishing the opening line of her speech, extolling the virtues of community service and generosity. She paused mid-sentence and scanned the audience, her eyes landing on me. I could see the brief flicker of recognition, a shadow of unease, before she smiled again, confident, untouchable. That confidence would unravel, and I would be patient in letting it happen. At the table, I placed the binder in front of the PDA president, making sure my hands were steady. You requested documentation regarding the loan my sister used for her Maldives trip? I said calmly. No one had to know the extent of the emotion coursing through me. My tone was neutral, almost bureaucratic, which lent an extra weight of authority. A few whispered murmurs went around the room. The PDA president, a woman who had always valued fairness over feelings, opened the binder and began scanning it. I didn't speak another word. The evidence, timestamps, transfers, screenshots, and messages told the story better than I ever could. Rebecca's smile faltered, then vanished entirely as she saw the first few pages. "Nick, what is this?" she asked, her voice rising slightly, a mix of shock and indignation. "I believe it's the story you've been hiding," I said evenly. "Everything's here, laid out in full detail." For a moment, she looked around at the crowd, probably hoping someone would step in to smooth over the embarrassment. But she found only silence. Curious eyes turned toward the binder, not her. The room wasn't laughing, but the tension was palpable. People were reading, whispering to each other, comparing faces to statements. There was no spin they could trust. It was all right there, black and white, incontrovertible. "Nick, this is private," she sputtered, her face going pale. "How could you?" I interrupted. "It's private only in the sense that truth is inconvenient for you. What's not private is the reality you've been presenting to everyone, that you were helping, sacrificing, and living modestly. The truth, as you can see, is something else entirely." The PDA president looked up from the binder. "Rebecca, are you aware of these transactions?" Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. She flipped through page after page of emails and bank statements, shaking her head slightly. "If these are accurate, then your reputation in this community needs some clarification." Rebecca's face twisted, a mix of fury and desperation. "This is insane. You're trying to ruin me in front of everyone. This is ridiculous, Nick. Mom said you were being dramatic." I glanced at Mom, who was sitting quietly in the third row, her hands trembling, her face pale but resolute. Her eyes met mine briefly, no words, just acknowledgement. She knew, finally, that I was right, that the documents spoke louder than any argument she had ignored. I turned back to Rebecca. "Mom didn't need me to tell her. I needed you to be confronted with reality. This isn't about drama, it's about accountability. You misused funds intended for critical support for our family. That's not drama, that's theft." Her composure crumbled entirely. The veneer of charm she had cultivated over decades peeled away in front of everyone. People began murmuring, some shaking their heads, others whispering questions to each other. The PDA president closed the binder, meeting her gaze firmly. "Rebecca, I think you need to explain to these people what's been happening, and perhaps consider restitution." Restitution. The word hung in the air. I didn't say a word because I didn't have to. I had planted the seeds for her downfall, and now the soil was fertile with her own missteps. She looked around, seeing the judgment forming quietly but firmly in everyone's eyes, and finally, for the first time, she felt small. Not a single person in the room was defending her. She had relied on assumptions of loyalty and manipulation, but the truth is its own force, and it had no interest in favoritism. She stammered, then tried to pivot. It was supposed to be a loan for family needs. I shook my head. It was supposed to preserve Mom's home. You took that money and used it for yourself. That's not a miscalculation, Rebecca. That's a decision, and it had consequences. The room stayed silent, absorbing the words. Her usual allies, neighbors, acquaintances, were visibly uncomfortable. No one wanted to side with someone who had clearly misrepresented facts in such a blatant, self-serving way. People were whispering, looking through the documents, nodding at one another. The ripple effect had begun. Rebecca's face turned red with anger and humiliation. She attempted to regain control, raising her voice, trying to redirect attention. "You think you're so perfect, Nick. You've always been so obsessed with control. But it didn't work. This time, the room didn't bend. This time, authority and evidence spoke louder than her theatrics. Her credibility, the fragile image she had curated for years, was cracking under the weight of indisputable proof. The PDA president interjected gently but firmly. "Rebecca, the facts speak for themselves. Your personal interpretation of events does not change what the records show." The whispers grew louder, neighbors shaking their heads, some avoiding her eyes entirely. She stumbled over words, attempting to explain herself, but the more she spoke, the more the audience saw the pattern, not the narrative she wanted to sell. Years of carefully cultivated charm evaporated under the harsh light of truth. And then came the final blow, a call from her own financial advisor, who had been looped in quietly by Maria. He confirmed the same discrepancies I had documented, withdrawals for personal vacations, unexplained transfers, and loans taken without full disclosure. By the time the advisor's call ended, Rebecca was visibly shaking, looking around the room as though seeking a miracle. There was none. I leaned against the wall quietly, observing the aftermath. People weren't mocking, they weren't laughing. They were simply aware. Awareness is more powerful than ridicule. Awareness changes perception, and perception, once shifted, cannot be undone. Mom exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders loosening slightly. She had been terrified of confrontation, worried about family chaos. But seeing the truth unfold, she finally allowed herself to relax, if only slightly. The chain of lies and entitlement that had shadowed our family for years was finally exposed, and she could see the reality of who Rebecca was. Rebecca sank into her chair, the glow of confidence entirely extinguished. For the first time, I saw vulnerability, fear, and disbelief collide in one person. She had relied on manipulation, on charm, on quiet coercion, and now she had nothing. She was untethered, facing a room full of people who could no longer be swayed by false narratives. I didn't gloat. I didn't yell or accuse. I simply observed, calm, as the dominoes fell. This was strategic, clinical, precise. Justice didn't require theatrics. It required preparation and the courage to see it through. Later, after the event, I met Mom outside. She hugged me quietly. "You did what I never could," she whispered. "Thank you." I nodded, feeling the weight of years of frustration lift slightly. The fallout for Rebecca was immediate and inevitable. The PDA removed her from leadership positions, citing a need for transparency and trust. Word spread through the neighborhood and the school board, rumors verified by the documents. Invitations she had taken for granted vanished. People who once deferred to her judgment now questioned it. Her family, previously enablers, began to reevaluate their complicity quietly. For me, nothing had changed in terms of my integrity. I didn't feel triumphant in a petty sense. I felt balanced. The scales had finally evened. I had shown, in the calmest, most deliberate way possible, that manipulation and entitlement do not trump truth and preparation. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't publicly humiliated anyone. I had simply provided the facts and allowed the natural consequences to unfold. Months later, Rebecca had retreated from the social circles she once dominated. Mom's home remained secure, stable, and entirely under her control, thanks to careful planning and some long overdue boundary setting. I continued building my career and business, unburdened by family debt or the expectation that I would sacrifice my life to prop up someone else's. And the most satisfying part? The moment of revelation. The moment when the truth landed so squarely, so inescapably, that no excuses, no tears, no manipulations could erase it. It was quiet, precise, and complete, a victory built on patience, intelligence, and self-respect. I looked at the binder one last time, now neatly archived in my office, and smiled faintly. Years of patience, planning, and preparation had led to this moment. The lesson was clear. Power lies not in anger or reaction, but in strategy, persistence, and truth. And as for Rebecca, she would think twice before underestimating anyone again. I leaned back in my chair, took a deep breath, and finally allowed myself to feel it, the calm, unshakable satisfaction of justice served. The scales were balanced, and I had won.